Sometimes the most profound moments in life come disguised as simple jokes. In 1880s New Mexico, an old Apache scout named Huyana had watched his world disappear piece by piece, until he believed his purpose had vanished with it. Working on the Henderson ranch, the cowboys saw him as a relic from another time. That morning, they were struggling with a wild mustang that had thrown every rider for 3 days straight. Huyana watched them fail again and again, then looked at 10-year-old Beth Henderson playing nearby. With a slight smile, he suggested the rancher's granddaughter should try riding the horse. Everyone laughed at the old man's joke. But when little Beth climbed onto that mustang's back, the horse went completely still. What happened next shocked everyone and revealed a truth about connection that none of them understood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson ranch, painting the high desert landscape in shades of gold and amber that reminded Huyana of better days. He sat on the weathered porch of the bunkhouse, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 62, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much change, too much loss. The small leather pouch at his belt, his medicine bag, contained the last tangible connections to a world that existed now only in memory. Frank Henderson owned 3,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving land in New Mexico territory. But he worked it with the determination of a man who understood that the West was changing, whether folks liked it or not. The railroad had come through 5 years back, bringing with it settlers, merchants, and the steady march of what people called civilization. Frank had adapted as practical men do, but he'd kept Huyana on his payroll when other ranchers might have sent the old Apache packing. He knows horses better than any man I've met, Frank would tell visitors who questioned the wisdom of keeping an Indian around. Long as he pulls his weight, he's got a place here. That was Frank's way. Gruff kindness wrapped in pragmatism. He'd found Huyana wandering the desert roads 3 years ago, thin as winter wind and carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and that worn leather pouch. Most men might have ridden past, but Frank had stopped. Maybe it was something in the old man's bearing, the way he carried himself despite his obvious hardship. Or maybe Frank recognized a fellow survivor when he saw one. The other hands tolerated Huyana with varying degrees of acceptance. There was Jimmy Cortez, barely 20, and full of swagger, who treated the old Apache like an amusing curiosity. Ask the old chief, Jimmy would say when someone wondered about weather patterns or water sources, his tone carrying just enough mockery to sting. Then there was Dutch Mueller, a thick-set German immigrant who spoke little English but worked twice as hard as any 2 men. Dutch seemed to understand something about being an outsider that the others missed. He'd nod respectfully to Huyana and sometimes share his tobacco without words. The foreman, a leathery Texan named Wade Hutchins, viewed Huyana with professional skepticism. "I've seen what his people can do," Wade would mutter when he thought. No one was listening. "Apache can track an ant across solid rock, but that don't make him trustworthy." Still, Wade couldn't argue with results, and Huyana had never given him cause for complaint. But it was 10-year-old Beth Henderson who saw past all the careful boundaries the adults had constructed. Frank's granddaughter had arrived at the ranch 6 months ago when her parents moved west from St. Louis, her father taking over the bookkeeping and business side of the operation, while her mother tried to adjust to life so far from civilization's comforts. Beth was a whirlwind of curiosity and fearless energy, with auburn braids that never stayed properly pinned and a spray of freckles across her nose that spoke of too much time in the desert sun. Her mother, Catherine, worried constantly about the impropriety of letting a young lady run wild among cowboys and dust. But Frank indulged his granddaughter's adventurous spirit. Girl's gotta learn the land if she's going to live on it, he'd say when Catherine fretted about Beth's latest escapade. From his quiet spot on the bunkhouse porch, Huyana watched the child with growing fascination. There was something different about her, something that reminded him of his own daughter, Huyana, whose name meant eternal blossom in the old language. Beth moved through the world with the same fearless grace, the same intuitive understanding of the rhythms around her. The horses sensed it too. While the ranch hands struggled with the more spirited animals, Beth could walk right up to the most skittish Mari and have her eating from her palm within minutes. The child seemed to speak a language that transcended words, communicating through touch and intention in ways that reminded Huyana of the old teachings. His medicine pouch contained reminders of those teachings. A piece of turquoise his grandmother had given him, a small bone whistle carved by his father, a dried sprig of sage that still held its sacred scent. These items were more than keepsakes. They were connections to a way of understanding the world that the white man's civilization had tried to erase. Huyana had been born in the Chiricahua Mountains when the Apache still moved freely across the desert, following the seasons and the game as their ancestors had done for countless generations. His Apache name, which he rarely spoke aloud anymore, meant falling rock, given to him after he'd survived a childhood accident that should have killed him. His grandmother said the spirits had protected him for some greater purpose. For 40 years, he'd tried to fulfill that purpose. He'd served as a scout for the cavalry, walking the dangerous line between two worlds, trying to broker peace when peace was possible and minimize bloodshed when it wasn't. He'd married a beautiful woman from the Mescalero band and raised 3 children who straddled both cultures with varying degrees of success. But the West had a way of taking everything a man held dear. Disease had claimed his wife. War had taken his eldest son. His daughter had died in the winter of 1882 at the San Carlos Reservation, her spirit broken by confinement and despair. His youngest boy had simply disappeared one day, walking into the desert and never returning. After that, Huyana had become what the Apache called a ghost walker, a man whose spirit had departed even though his body continued to draw breath. He'd wandered for months, carrying only his medicine pouch and the weight of memories that grew heavier with each passing day. Frank Henderson had given him more than work. He'd given him a reason to remain among the living. The routine of ranch life, the predictable rhythms of caring for animals, the simple dignity of earning his keep. These things had slowly called his spirit back from the edge of the void. Now, watching young Beth chase a butterfly through the sagebrush, her laughter carrying on the morning breeze, Huyana felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was buried forever. Hope, perhaps, or purpose. The child reminded him that life had a way of offering unexpected gifts to those patient enough to receive them. The ranch house itself told the story of a family adapting to their circumstances. Built in the territorial style with thick adobe walls and a red tile roof, it sprawled across a small rise that gave it a commanding view of the surrounding valley. Catherine had tried to bring touches of St. Louis refinement to the interior delicate. China displayed in a handcrafted cabinet, heavy curtains that blocked out the harsh desert light, a piano that seemed absurdly out of place but filled the evening hours with melodies that softened the harsh edges of frontier life. Beth's father, Thomas, was a gentleman better suited to ledger books than livestock, but he'd thrown himself into learning the ranch business with admirable determination. He treated Huyana with polite respect, asking questions about the land and the animals with genuine interest. Thomas seemed to understand that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. The daily rhythms of ranch life created their own music. Dawn brought the lowing of cattle being moved to fresh pasture, the creak of leather saddles, and the cheerful profanity of men beginning another day's work. Midday offered the blessed quiet of siesta, when even the most energetic sought shade from the relentless sun. Evening brought the sounds of horses being unsaddled, tools being cleaned and stored, and the gradual gathering of men around the cook fire for supper and conversation. Huyana participated in this rhythm without fully belonging to it. He did his work well mending fences, gentling green horses, tracking strays across the desert, but always remained slightly apart. The other hands included him in their conversations, but rarely sought his opinions on anything beyond practical matters. They saw him as useful, but not quite one of them. Only Beth seemed oblivious to these invisible boundaries. She'd appeared at his elbow one morning while he was braiding a new rope, watching his hands work with intense concentration. "How do you make it so tight?" she'd asked, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "Practice," he'd answered, then found himself showing her the pattern, guiding her small fingers through the weave. From that moment, she'd become his shadow during her free hours, peppering him with questions about everything from why horses rolled in dust to how he could predict weather by watching clouds. Her hunger for knowledge reminded him of his own children at that age, before the world had taught them to be cautious about crossing cultural lines. Catherine worried about these interactions, though she tried to hide her concern behind polite smiles. "Beth, don't bother Mr. Huyana when he's working," she'd call, using the name he'd given the family when he arrived, a simplified version that white tongues could manage. But Frank encouraged the friendship. "Old man knows more about this country than the rest of us combined," he'd tell his daughter-in-law. Girl could learn worse things than respecting her elders and listening to wisdom. The truth was more complex than Frank realized. Huyana found himself torn between the pleasure of sharing his knowledge with an eager student and the fear of passing on teachings that belonged to a dying world. Every story he told Beth, every skill he demonstrated, felt like both a gift and a betrayal. A gift to the child who received it with such joy, and a betrayal of the ancestors who had never intended such knowledge to cross cultural boundaries. But watching Beth's natural affinity with the animals, seeing her instinctive understanding of things that couldn't be taught from books, Huyana began to wonder if the spirits had guided him to this place for a reason he was only beginning to understand. Perhaps some wisdom was meant to survive, regardless of the vessel that carried it forward. The wild mustang had arrived 3 days ago, brought in by a crew of wranglers who'd caught him running free in the desert. He was a magnificent animal colt, black with white markings on his face and legs, standing nearly 16 hands high with the lean build of a horse bred by wind and open spaces rather than human intention. "He's a beauty," Frank had admitted, watching the stallion pace the confines of the breaking pen like a caged storm. "But he's got devil in him." Threw Rodriguez clean over the fence yesterday. The hands had taken turns trying to break the horse, each convinced he'd be the one to succeed where others had failed. Jimmy Cortez had lasted less than 10 seconds before finding himself face first in the dust. Dutch Mueller had managed to stay mounted longer, but the horse's twisting, sunfishing bucks had eventually unseated even his superior strength and balance. Wade Hutchins had approached the task with professional determination, using every trick he'd learned in 30 years of breaking horses. But the Mustang seemed to anticipate each move, responding to pressure with explosive resistance that left Wade nursing bruised ribs and wounded pride. From his vantage point on the bunkhouse porch, Huyana had watched these failed attempts with growing interest. The horse wasn't just wild. He was intelligent, strategic in his resistance. Each failed ride taught him new ways to defeat his would-be masters. He was learning faster than the men trying to break him. More importantly, Huyana recognized something in the animal's eyes that the others missed. This wasn't just defiance born of wildness. This was a creature who had learned that trust was dangerous, that submission meant death of spirit, if not of body. The horse had been free, and freedom, once tasted, was not easily forgotten. As the third day dawned with the Mustang still unridden, Huyana found himself drawn to the breaking pen. The horse stood in the center of the enclosure, head high, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of approaching humans. There was no fear in his posture, only vigilant readiness. Beth appeared at Huyana's side, as she so often did, her presence announced only by the whisper of bare feet on packed earth. She climbed onto the fence rail beside him, studying the horse with the same intense concentration she brought to all her interests. "He's beautiful," she breathed, and something in her voice made the horse's ears swivel toward her. "Yes, Huyana," agreed, and angry. "Why?" Beth asked, the question carrying the weight of genuine curiosity rather than casual interest. Huyana considered his answer carefully. "He remembers what he was before men caught him. Some spirits are not meant to be broken." Beth nodded as if this made perfect sense, which perhaps, to her, it did. She possessed that gift of childhood, the ability to accept profound truths without the need for complex explanation. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities neither could yet imagine. The wild mustang waited in his pen, the embodiment of untamed spirit meeting immovable determination. The ranch hands prepared for another day of struggle and likely failure. And somewhere in the space between human ambition and animal wisdom, forces were aligning that would change everything. Huyana felt the weight of his medicine pouch against his hip and wondered if his grandmother's prediction was finally coming to pass. Perhaps the spirits had indeed protected him for some greater purpose, a purpose that had nothing to do with his own plans and everything to do with a fearless child and a horse who refused to surrender his soul. The morning of the fourth day broke crisp and clear, with that peculiar quality of light that made the desert seem to glow from within. Huyana had been awake since before dawn, as was his custom, sitting in meditation as the eastern sky slowly painted itself in shades of rose and gold. The medicine pouch in his lap felt warm to the touch, as if the sacred items within were stirring with their own energy. Something was different about this day. He could feel it in the way the wind carried sounds, in the restless shifting of the horses in the corral, in the very texture of the air itself. Change was coming, riding the morning breeze like an invisible messenger dot. By the time the other hands had stumbled from their bunks and gathered around the cook fire for coffee and biscuits, the wild mustang was already pacing his pen with renewed vigor. The horse seemed to sense the approaching confrontation, his dark coat gleaming in the early light as he moved with the fluid grace of water over stone. Wade Hutchins stood at the fence, studying the animal with professional calculation. His ribs were still tender from his encounter 2 days earlier, but his pride demanded another attempt. "Today's the day," he announced to the gathered men, his voice carrying the forced confidence of a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Jimmy Cortez laughed, but the sound held an edge. "Hell, Wade, that horse made you look like a greenhorn fresh off the wagon train. Maybe it's time to admit some horses ain't meant to be broke." "Every horse can be broken," Wade replied grimly, adjusting his leather gloves with deliberate care. "It's just a matter of finding the right approach." Dutch Mueller said nothing, but his skeptical expression spoke volumes. He'd watched too many good men get hurt by stubborn animals to believe that force alone could solve every problem. Frank Henderson approached the group, drawn by the familiar ritual of morning optimism meeting equine reality. His granddaughter, Beth, trailed behind him, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. The child had an uncanny ability to appear wherever something interesting was about to happen. "You sure about this, Wade?" Frank asked, eyeing the mustang's taut posture. "That horse has fire in him that might not be worth the risk." Wade's jaw tightened. As foreman, his authority rested partly on his ability to handle difficult animals. 3 days of failure had begun to erode his standing with the men, and everyone knew it. "I've broken horses from Mexico to Montana," Wade said. "This one's no different." But Huyana, watching from his position near the breaking pen, knew better. This horse was very different indeed. The mustang carried himself with the dignity of a chief, his head high and eyes bright with intelligence. More importantly, he showed no signs of the gradual resignation that usually marked a horse's submission to human will. The morning ritual began as it had for 3 days running. Wade entered the pen slowly, rope in hand, his movements calm and deliberate. The mustang watched him approach, muscles coiled like springs beneath his glossy coat. For 10 minutes, Wade worked to get close enough to slip the rope around the horse's neck. The mustang allowed the approach, standing still as carved stone. But his eyes never stopped tracking every movement. When Wade finally managed to secure the rope, the horse exploded into motion. What followed was less like breaking and more like warfare. The mustang didn't just buck, he fought with strategic intelligence, using the rope as a weapon, spinning and rearing in combinations designed to maximize the punishment delivered to his rider. Wade managed to stay mounted for nearly 30 seconds this time, longer than any previous attempt. But the result was inevitable. The horse's final maneuver was a thing of terrible beauty, a high, twisting leap that seemed to suspend both animal and rider in midair for an impossible moment before gravity reclaimed them. Wade hit the ground hard, rolling away as the mustang's hooves pounded the earth where he'd fallen. "Damn horse is trying to kill somebody," Jimmy muttered, but there was admiration in his voice. Wade climbed to his feet, dusting off his pants and trying to salvage his dignity. Blood trickled from a split lip, and he moved with the careful stiffness of a man inventorying his injuries. "Maybe that's enough for today," Frank suggested diplomatically. "Like hell," Wade spat, then caught himself with a glance at Beth. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Henderson, but I'm not walking away from this." The second attempt lasted even less time than the first. The mustang seemed to have learned from their previous encounter, adjusting his tactics to exploit Wade's weaknesses. The foreman found himself airborne almost immediately, landing in a heap near the fence as the horse pranced away with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "Wade, that's enough," Frank said firmly. "Horse is going to hurt someone. Seriously, if we keep this up. Then maybe we should try a different approach," Jimmy suggested. "Dutch, you want another go?" The big German shook his head emphatically. "That horse, he's too much for me. I know when I'm beaten." A frustrated silence settled over the group as they watched the mustang resume his pacing. The animal showed no signs of exhaustion from his exertions. If anything, he seemed energized by his victories. It was in this moment of collective defeat that Huyana felt the first stirring of an idea so audacious it almost took his breath away. He looked at young Beth, who had been watching the proceedings with rapt attention, her green eyes bright with fascination rather than fear. The child possessed something the men lacked, something that had nothing to do with strength or experience, or stubborn pride. She approached the world with open curiosity rather than the need to dominate it. More importantly, she carried no preconceptions about what was possible or impossible. The idea grew stronger, fed by memories of his grandmother's teachings about the old ways of training horses, methods that relied on partnership rather than conquest. His people had never sought to break horses, but to find harmony with them, creating relationships built on mutual respect and understanding. He watched Beth climb onto the fence rail for a better view, her small figure silhouetted against the morning sky. The mustang's ears swiveled toward her, and for a moment, their gazes met across the dusty expanse of the pen. "What do you think, old-timer?" Jimmy called out, following the direction of Huyana's gaze. "You got any Apache magic that might work on this devil?" The question was asked in jest, but Huyana heard something else beneath the mockery genuine. Curiosity about alternatives to the failing methods they'd been employing. A slow smile spread across Huyana's weathered features, and he felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a familiar blanket. His grandmother had always said that wisdom revealed itself in its own time, and perhaps that time was now. "Maybe we ask someone the horse might trust," he said quietly. "Who's that?" Wade asked, his voice tight with frustration. Huyana's smile widened as he nodded toward Beth, who was still perched on the fence rail like a small bird, completely absorbed in studying the magnificent animal before her. "Maybe we ask the little one." The suggestion hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jimmy Cortez burst into laughter, the sound sharp and disbelieving. "You want to put that little girl on that horse?" he gasped between chuckles. "Old man, I think the desert sun has finally baked your brain." But Frank Henderson didn't laugh. He looked from his granddaughter to the wild mustang, then back to Huyana with growing thoughtfulness. Something in the Apache's expression made him hesitate before dismissing the idea outright. "That horse would kill her," Wade said flatly. "I won't be party to putting a child in danger, would he?" Huyana asked softly, his gaze never leaving Beth's small figure. "Or would he see what we cannot?" Beth, sensing that she had become the focus of attention, turned to look at the adults with bright curiosity. "What are you talking about?" Frank cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. "Mr. Huyana thinks you might have better luck with the horse than we've been having." "Really?" Beth's eyes lit up with excitement rather than fear. "Could I try?" "Absolutely not," came Catherine's voice from behind them. Beth's mother had emerged from the house, drawn by the sounds of commotion. "I won't have my daughter anywhere near that dangerous animal." But even as the adults began to debate the wisdom and safety of Huyana's suggestion, the Mustang had stopped his restless pacing. He stood perfectly still in the center of the pen, his dark eyes fixed on the small figure perched on the fence rail. Something had shifted in his posture, a subtle relaxation that spoke of recognition or understanding. Beth felt it too. She slipped down from the fence and walked to where the pen gate stood closed, her movements slow and deliberate. The horse tracked her progress, his ears forward with interest rather than alarm. "He wants to meet me," she said, with the quiet certainty that only children possess. "I can feel it." And in that moment, standing in the dust and morning light with the wild mustang watching her every move, something ancient and profound began to stir, a recognition that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, between cultures, between the old ways and the new. The moment Beth Henderson's small boots touched the ground inside the breaking pen, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the ever-present desert wind stilled to a whisper, as if nature itself was waiting to witness what would unfold. The wild mustang stood motionless in the center of the enclosure, his dark coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning sun. His ears remained forward, alert but not alarmed, as Beth took her first tentative steps toward him. The child moved with the careful grace that came naturally to her, each footfall deliberate and respectful. "Sweet Jesus," Wade Hutchins muttered under his breath, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on the fence rail as if preparing to vault into the pen at the first sign of trouble. Catherine Henderson had fallen silent, one hand pressed to her throat as she watched her daughter approach. 1,500 pounds of unpredictable wildness. Frank's arm had found its way around his daughter-in-law's shoulders, offering what comfort he could, while his own heart hammered against his ribs. But it was Huyana who watched with the deepest understanding. In the child's measured approach, he recognized echoes of the old ways his grandmother had taught him, the patient respect that true horsemen showed when entering an animal's world as a guest, rather than a conqueror. Beth stopped 3 feet from the Mustang, close enough to touch, but careful not to crowd. The horse lowered his magnificent head, nostrils flaring as he drew in her scent. For long moments, girl and horse simply studied each other, communication flowing between them in ways that transcended human understanding. "Easy, boy," Beth whispered, her voice barely audible even in the profound quiet that had settled over the ranch yard. "I'm not here to hurt you." The Mustang's response was subtle but unmistakable. The tension that had defined his posture for 3 days of failed breaking. Attempts melted away degree by degree. His head dropped lower, and he took a single step toward the child, not aggressive, but curious. Beth extended her hand, palm up, allowing the horse to investigate at his own pace. The Mustang's velvet muzzle touched her fingers with the delicacy of a butterfly landing on a flower. His breath was warm against her skin, and she giggled softly at the tickling sensation. "Good boy," she murmured, and the horse's ears swiveled forward as if he understood. Not just her words, but her intention. What happened next defied every assumption. The watching adults held about horse breaking and human limitations. Beth placed her other hand against the Mustang's powerful neck, and instead of shying away, the animal leaned into her touch. She began to stroke his coat with gentle, rhythmic movements, and the horse's eyes half closed in what could only be described as blasé contentment. "I'll be damned," Jimmy Cortez breathed, his earlier laughter completely forgotten. "Look at that horse." The transformation was remarkable. Where moments before had stood a creature of barely contained wildness, now stood a horse at peace. The rigid alertness had been replaced by relaxed curiosity. The flashing eyes had softened with something approaching trust. Beth continued her gentle ministrations, running her hands along the horse's neck and shoulder, speaking to him in soft tones that carried across the pen like a lullaby. The Mustang responded by turning his head to nuzzle her shoulder, a gesture of acceptance that brought tears to more than one pair of watching eyes. "How is she doing that?" Catherine whispered, her voice thick with wonder and residual fear. Huyana's answer came quietly, heavy with memories of teachings passed down through generations. "She listens with more than her ears. She speaks with more than her voice." After what felt like hours but was probably no more than 10 minutes, Beth took hold of the rope that still hung around the Mustang's neck, the same rope that had become a battlefield implement during Wade's attempts. In her small hands, it was simply a means of connection. "I think he'll let me ride him now," she announced with the matter-of-fact confidence that only children possess. "Beth, no." Catherine started forward, but Frank's gentle hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let's see what happens." Huyana had already moved to the fence, his weathered hands gripping the rails as he leaned forward. Every instinct told him that something sacred was unfolding, something that deserved witness and respect rather than interference. Beth led the Mustang to the fence, her movements unhurried and natural. The horse followed willingly, his earlier resistance completely absent. When she asked him to stop with a gentle pressure on the rope, he complied immediately. Using the fence rail as a mounting block, Beth climbed carefully onto the Mustang's bare back. The horse stood perfectly still as she settled herself, her small legs barely spanning his broad barrel. She gathered the rope loosely in her hands, more for balance than control, and leaned forward to pat his neck. "Ready, boy?" she asked, and the horse turned his head slightly as if nodding his agreement. What followed was not the explosive bucking and spinning that had characterized every previous attempt. Instead, the Mustang began to walk with measured steps, carrying his precious cargo with the care of a mother with her foal. Beth moved with him naturally, her body finding the rhythm of his gait without conscious thought. They made a slow circuit of the pen, horse and rider moving in perfect harmony. The Mustang's ears stayed forward, alert but relaxed, and Beth's laughter rang out like silver bells in the desert air. "Would you look at that?" Dutch Mueller said softly, his accented voice filled with amazement. "It's like they danced together." The ride lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes contained a lifetime of revelation. When Beth finally asked the horse to stop, he complied immediately. When she slipped down from his back, he turned to nuzzle her hair affectionately. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the ranch. Each person present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, though none could fully articulate what it meant. Beth walked to the fence where the adults waited, her face glowing with joy and accomplishment. The Mustang followed her partway, then stood watching as she climbed through the rails to safety. "How did you know he would be gentle with you?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Beth considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He told me," she said simply, not with words, but I could feel it. "He's not mean, he's just scared and lonely." Catherine knelt to embrace her daughter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You could have been killed," she whispered against Beth's hair. "No, Mama," Beth replied with serene confidence. "He would never hurt me. We're friends now." Over her daughter's head, Catherine's eyes found Huyana's weathered face. The old Apache was smiling with deep satisfaction, as if some long-held belief had finally been validated. "How did you know?" she asked him. Huyana's answer came slowly, weighted with the wisdom of decades. "Some souls recognize each other across all the barriers we build. The child has the gift. She speaks the language that all creatures understand." Wade Hutchins shook his head in bewilderment. "I've been breaking horses for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like that." "What's her secret?" "No secret," Huyana replied, his gaze returning to the Mustang, who still watched Beth with obvious devotion. She did not try to break him. She asked him to be her friend. As the group began to disperse, each person carrying away their own interpretation of what they had witnessed, Beth lingered at the fence. The Mustang had moved closer, pressing his muzzle against the rails where she could reach him. "What will you call him?" Huyana asked, approaching to stand beside her. Beth stroked the horse's nose thoughtfully. "Thunderwalker," she said after a moment, "because he moves like storm clouds crossing the desert." Huyana nodded approvingly. It was a name that honored both the horse's power and his grace, a name worthy of the magnificent creature who had chosen to trust a fearless child. The morning that had begun with another failed attempt at domination had ended with something far more precious, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. It was, Huyana realized, exactly the kind of lesson the world needed more of. In the days following Beth's miraculous first ride on Thunderwalker, the Henderson ranch buzzed with a kind of quiet excitement that seemed to infect everyone from the hired hands to the livestock. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the small network of neighboring ranches and the nearby town of Messia, creating ripples of curiosity and disbelief that extended far beyond the ranch boundaries. Huyana found himself in an unfamiliar position, suddenly elevated from tolerated oddity to reluctant celebrity. Neighbors who had previously nodded politely but distantly now sought him out with questions about horse training and Apache methods. The transformation made him uncomfortable, but it also stirred something long dormant in his spirit. On the third morning after Beth's ride, he discovered her waiting for him beside Thunderwalker's corral, her small wooden horse figure, a toy carved by her father, clutched in her hands. The Mustang had been moved to his own paddock, away from the other horses whose nervous energy seemed to agitate him. "Will you teach me more?" she asked without preamble, her green eyes bright with eagerness. "About horses, I mean." "About how you do it." Huyana studied the child's earnest face, seeing in her expression the same hunger for knowledge that had once driven him to seek wisdom from his elders. The wooden horse in her hands was crudely carved but lovingly made, its simple lines capturing something essential about equine grace. "Your parents, they approve of such teaching?" he asked carefully, aware that the morning's events had created both opportunity and danger. Beth's face fell slightly. "Mama is still scared about what happened. She says it was dangerous and I shouldn't have done it." But Papa, he says I have a gift, and gifts shouldn't be wasted. She looked up at him with hopeful eyes. Besides, you were the one who said I could do it. You must know how to teach me the right way. The simple faith in her voice touched something deep in Huyana's chest. Here was a child willing to trust him with her safety and her dreams, asking him to share knowledge that his own people had spent generations perfecting. He glanced toward the ranch house, where Catherine Henderson could be seen through the kitchen window, her movements sharp with barely contained anxiety. The woman's fear was understandable. She had watched her 10-year-old daughter climb onto a wild horse and somehow emerge unscathed. Such experiences were enough to shake anyone's sense of the world's predictability. But Frank Henderson's reaction had been different. The ranch owner had spent the evening, after Beth's ride, asking careful questions about Apache horse training methods, his interest clearly extending beyond mere curiosity to genuine respect for knowledge he was beginning to understand he lacked. Teaching takes time, Huyana warned gently, and patience. The old ways cannot be learned in a day or a week. They must grow inside you like seeds in good soil. Beth nodded solemnly, her grip tightening on the wooden horse. I have time. And I'm not afraid of work. Something in her voice, the quiet determination that reminded him so powerfully of his lost daughter, made Huyana's decision for him. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded the cloth, it revealed a horse carved from dark wood, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. My father made this for me when I was younger than you, he said, placing the carving in Beth's palm alongside her own wooden horse. He said it would teach me to see horses as they truly are, not as beasts to be conquered, but as spirits to be understood. Beth examined the ancient carving with reverent attention. Unlike her father's well-intentioned but crude effort, this horse seemed to capture something essential about equine nature: the alertness, the grace, the barely contained power that defined creatures born to run free. It's beautiful, she whispered. Does it really teach you things? Everything teaches, if you know how to listen, Huyana replied. The carving reminds you to look beyond what your eyes see to what your heart knows. Horses speak a language older than words. They respond to intention, to the spirit you carry inside you. Over the following weeks, these morning lessons became a cherished routine. Huyana would arrive at Thunderwalker's paddock just after dawn, carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations in his weathered hands and patient voice. Beth would appear shortly after, her eagerness barely contained as she prepared to absorb whatever knowledge he was willing to share. The lessons began with stillness, learning to quiet the restless energy that made most humans so uncomfortable. To horses, Huyana taught Beth to sit motionless beside the corral fence, simply observing Thunderwalker's natural behaviors without the need to interact or interfere. Watch how he moves when he thinks no one is looking, Huyana instructed. See how his ears tell you what he is thinking before his body shows you what he will do. Beth proved to be an exceptional student, possessing the rare combination of natural intuition and learned discipline that marked true horsemen. She could sit for an hour without fidgeting, her attention completely focused on the mustang as he went about his daily routines. He's telling me about the water, she announced one morning, her voice filled with quiet excitement. The way he lifts his head and sniffs, he can smell rain coming from far away. Huyana smiled, remembering his own first recognition of such subtle communications. What else does he tell you? Beth studied the horse with growing confidence. He misses running free. Sometimes he looks toward the mountains and his whole body changes, like he's remembering something beautiful that hurts. The accuracy of her observations impressed even Huyana, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the complex emotional lives of horses. The child seemed to possess an innate understanding that couldn't be taught, only cultivated as the lessons progressed. They move beyond mere observation to active communication. Huyana taught Beth the Apache way of approaching horses with respect rather than dominance, invitation rather than demand. Never take, he explained as they worked with Thunder Walker in the larger paddock. Always ask. The horse chooses whether to give you his trust. Your job is to be worthy of that choice. Under Huyana's guidance, Beth learned to read the subtle signals that indicated a horse's willingness to cooperate. The angle of ears, the set of shoulders, the rhythm of breathing all carried messages that spoke of acceptance or resistance, comfort or anxiety. Thunder Walker seemed to understand that he was part of a teaching process. He tolerated Beth's inexperienced handling with remarkable patience, correcting her mistakes gently rather than dramatically. When she pulled too hard on the rope, he would stop and turn his head toward her, his dark eyes patient but reproving. When she approached too quickly, he would take a single step backward, enough to make his point without creating fear. He's teaching me too, Beth observed after one such correction. He wants me to do better, but he's not mean about it. The best teachers are often our students, Huyana agreed. Thunder Walker knows you are learning. He chooses to help you because he sees your good heart. Not everyone on the ranch viewed these developments with such equanimity. Wade Hutchins watched the lessons with barely concealed resentment, his professional pride still stinging from his failures with the Mustang. That a child could succeed where he had failed challenged fundamental assumptions about horsemanship and authority. "It ain't natural," he muttered to Jimmy Cortez one evening as they watched Beth lead Thunder Walker through a series of simple exercises. "Girl's got no business handling that horse. Something's bound to go wrong." Ginny, however, had been won over by the obvious care and skill Huyana brought to the teaching process. "Seems to me the old man knows what he's doing," he replied, "and that horse is gentler now than most of our broke animals." The transformation in Thunder Walker was indeed remarkable. The wild-eyed, dangerous creature that had terrorized would-be riders had become a responsive, cooperative partner under Beth's gentle guidance. He still possessed all his natural fire and independence, but he had learned to channel those qualities into willing partnership rather than resistant defiance. Catherine Henderson remained conflicted about her daughter's new passion. She couldn't deny the obvious benefits. Beth was learning responsibility, developing confidence, and forming a relationship with Huyana that seemed to enrich both their lives. But the mother's protective instincts warred with her desire to support her daughter's obvious gift. "She's so young," Catherine confided to her father-in-law one evening as they watched Beth grooming Thunder Walker with careful strokes. "What if something goes wrong? What if the horse forgets himself?" Frank's response reflected the growing respect he felt for both the old Apache's wisdom and his granddaughter's remarkable abilities. "Catherine, I've been around horses for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what that child can do." Huyana's teaching her right with respect and patience. Maybe it's time we trusted both of them. As the weeks passed, the morning lessons expanded beyond basic horsemanship to include elements of Apache philosophy and natural observation. Huyana found himself sharing stories from his youth, teaching Beth to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to understand the complex social structures of horse herds, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated a horse's physical and emotional well-being. "My grandmother used to say that horses were gifts from the spirit world," he told Beth one morning as they watched Thunder Walker interact with the other horses in the adjoining paddock. "They came to teach us about partnership and trust. But somewhere along the way, many people forgot how to listen to their lessons." Beth absorbed these teachings with the serious attention they deserved, but she also brought her own insights to their discussions. Her questions often forced Huyana to examine his own assumptions and beliefs, challenging him to articulate knowledge that he had previously accepted without analysis. "If horses are gifts from the spirits," she asked one day, Why do people try so hard to break them? Wouldn't it be better to learn from them instead? The question struck Huyana with unexpected force, highlighting the fundamental difference between Apache and white approaches to horse training. It also revealed the profound wisdom that could emerge from innocence unencumbered by cultural assumptions. Yes, he answered quietly, it would be much better. But teaching people to listen is harder than teaching them to dominate. Fear makes many people choose force over patience. As their partnership deepened, both teacher and student began to sense that their work together was leading towards something larger than simple horse training. The bond between Beth and Thunder Walker had become a bridge between worlds, a living demonstration that understanding could transcend cultural boundaries and that wisdom, properly shared, could create something beautiful from the materials of loss and hope. The eagle feather came to Huyana in a dream on a night when the desert wind carried the scent of distant rain and memories too painful to face while awake. In the vision, his grandmother stood beside a clear stream, her weathered hands extended toward him, holding a single golden eagle feather that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The child walks between worlds," she said in the dream, her voice carrying the authority of one who had passed beyond earthly concerns. "She will need protection for the journey ahead. Give her the tools her spirit requires." Huyana woke before dawn with the dream still vivid in his memory and a profound sense that change was approaching like thunder rolling across the desert. He rose and walked outside, where the first pale light of sunrise was beginning to paint the eastern mountains in shades of rose and golden as if summoned by his need. He found the feather lying at the base of the ancient cottonwood that shaded the bunkhouse, a magnificent golden eagle feather, perfect in every detail, placed there by forces he didn't question but gratefully accepted. Later that morning, as Beth arrived for her daily lesson with Thunder Walker, Huyana presented her with the sacred gift. The child received it with the reverence he had hoped for, understanding instinctively that this was more than mere decoration. "My grandmother always said that eagle feathers carry the prayers of the people to the spirit world," he explained, as Beth examined the feather with careful attention. "They also bring protection and wisdom to those who carry them with proper respect." "What does it mean that you're giving it to me?" Beth asked, her green eyes serious beyond her years. Huyana considered his answer carefully, aware that he was crossing cultural boundaries that many of his people would consider sacred and inviolable. But the dream had been clear, and his grandmother's spirit had never led him astray. "It means you are walking a path that few have traveled," he said finally. "Between the old ways and the new, between different peoples, between what was and what might be. The feather will remind you to stay true to your heart when others try to turn you from your path." The lessons that followed took on new depth and intensity. With the eagle feather secured carefully in her hair, Beth seemed to absorb Huyana's teachings with even greater understanding. She learned to read the subtle communications between horses in a herd, to recognize the signs of illness or injury before they became obvious, to understand the complex relationships that existed within the animal community. More importantly, she began to grasp the philosophical foundations that underpinned Apache horsemanship, the belief that all living creatures possess spirits worthy of respect, that partnership was always preferable to domination, that true strength came from harmony rather than force. "Watch how Thunder Walker greets the other horses," Huyana instructed one morning as they observed the Mustang's interactions with the ranch horses in the adjoining paddock. "See how he shows respect while maintaining his dignity. He does not challenge unnecessarily, but he does not submit to those who would abuse his kindness." Beth studied the intricate social dance taking place before them, her understanding growing as she witnessed the subtle negotiations that maintained peace within the herd. Thunder Walker had indeed found his place among the ranch horses, respected for his strength and independence, but not feared for his wildness. "He's teaching them too," she observed with growing excitement. "The other horses move differently now, more proudly. He's showing them they don't have to be afraid all the time. Huyana smiled at her insight, recognizing in her words a wisdom that went far beyond horsemanship. The child was beginning to understand that true leadership emerged from example rather than force. That dignity was contagious when properly demonstrated. But not everyone on the ranch appreciated these developments. As Beth's skills grew and her bond with Thunder Walker deepened, tensions began to surface among the hired hands. Wade Hutchins, in particular, watched the daily lessons with increasing resentment. "It ain't right," he complained to anyone who would listen. Girl's getting ideas above her station, thinking she knows more about horses than men who've been working with them for decades. His criticism found receptive ears among some of the newer hands, men who felt threatened by the suggestion that their methods might be improved upon by an old Indian and a 10-year-old girl. The success of Huyana's teaching challenged their assumptions about authority and expertise in ways that made them deeply uncomfortable. Jimmy Cortez, however, had become a convert to the Apache methods after watching their results. "Can't argue with success," he told Wade during one particularly heated discussion. "That Mustang's worth twice what he was when he was fighting everyone who tried to ride him. Horse is probably just worn down," Wade replied stubbornly. "Give him time, and his true nature will come out. Wild things don't change their spots just because some old Indian whispers sweet words in their ears." The tension came to a head on a sweltering afternoon when Beth was working with Thunder Walker in the large paddock, practicing the intricate communication exercises that Huyana had taught her. Several of the hands had gathered to watch. Their attitudes ranging from admiration to skepticism. Wade chose that moment to assert his authority, striding into the paddock without invitation or warning. "That's enough playing around," he announced, his voice loud enough to startle both horse and rider. "Time to see if this horse can do real work." Thunder Walker's reaction was immediate and alarming. The Mustang's head shot up, his eyes rolling, white as the aggressive energy radiating from Wade triggered instincts forged by months of brutal treatment. The horse sidled away from the foreman, his muscles tensing for flight or fight. Beth felt the change instantly, her connection with Thunder Walker alerting her to his distress before her eyes could register the physical signs. "Mr. Hutchins, please," she said, her voice carrying a calm authority that seemed impossible in someone so young. "You're frightening him." "I'm not frightening nothing," Wade snapped, his pride stung by the suggestion that his presence was unwelcome. "This is still a working ranch, not some Indian medicine show." He reached for Thunder Walker's halter with the rough confidence that had served him well with broken horses. But the Mustang was no longer the trusting animal that had accepted Beth's gentle touch. The horse reared back, pulling against the rope with enough force to drag the child several feet before she managed to regain her balance. "See?" Wade said with grim satisfaction. "Horse is still wild as the day he was caught. All this gentle handling is just make-believe." But Huyana had appeared at the paddock fence, his weathered face dark with anger that few had ever seen him. "Display, you will leave now," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command despite its soft volume. "I don't take orders from—" Wade began, but something in Huyana's expression stopped him mid-sentence. "You will leave now," the old Apache repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the steel beneath the silk of his words. For a moment, the two men faced each other across 30 years of cultural divide and personal resentment. Then Wade's gaze shifted to Thunder Walker, who had calmed the instant Huyana appeared, and to Beth, who was stroking the horse's neck with practiced skill. "This ain't over," Wade muttered, but he left the paddock with as much dignity as he could muster. The incident marked a turning point in the ranch's dynamics. Frank Henderson, who had witnessed the confrontation from the porch, made it clear that Beth's lessons with Huyana would continue without interference. But the seeds of larger conflict had been planted, and everyone could sense that the fragile harmony they had achieved was more precious and more fragile than anyone had realized. That evening, as Beth carefully cleaned and secured the eagle feather in her room, she found herself thinking about the wisdom Huyana had been sharing with her. The path between worlds was indeed difficult to walk, requiring strength and grace in equal measure. But as she looked out her window toward the paddock where Thunderwalker stood silhouetted against the sunset, she felt a deep certainty that the journey was worth whatever challenges lay ahead. The photograph had been hidden in Huyana's medicine pouch for 15 years, wrapped in soft doeskin and tucked beneath the other sacred items that connected him to his lost world. It was a formal tintype taken at the San Carlos Reservation in 1868, capturing a moment of dignity amid the systematic destruction of Apache culture. Beth discovered it by accident on a morning when Huyana had asked her to retrieve a piece of sage from his pouch for a blessing ceremony they were performing. With Thunderwalker, her small fingers brushed against the wrapped photograph, and something in its weight and texture made her pause. "What's this?" she asked, holding the mysterious package with careful reverence. Huyana's face went still as death, his weathered features freezing into an expression that spoke of pain too deep for words. For a long moment, he said nothing, his dark eyes fixed on the bundle in Beth's hands, as if it contained the power to resurrect the dead or destroy the living. "Something I thought I could forget," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Beth sensed the profound significance of the moment, the weight of memory and loss that surrounded the hidden photograph like a shroud. With the intuitive wisdom that had guided her relationship with Thunderwalker, she remained perfectly still, allowing Huyana to decide whether to share this burden or carry it alone. Slowly, as if moving through water, Huyana reached for the photograph. His fingers trembled slightly as he unwrapped the doeskin, revealing the faded image beneath. The tintype showed a Apache family, a man in his prime, a beautiful woman, and 3 children ranging in age from infant to adolescent. "My family," Huyana said, the words emerging like blood from a deep wound. "Taken in the last year we were together." Beth studied the photograph with the serious attention it deserved, seeing in the formal poses the echoes of lives lived with dignity despite impossible circumstances. The man in the image was clearly Huyana, though decades younger and wearing the confident bearing of someone who believed his world still had room for hope. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "What happened to them?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with it the weight of all the losses that had shaped the American West. Huyana stared at the photograph for a long time before beginning to speak, his voice carrying the cadence of a man reciting prayers for the dead. "My wife was called Morning Star," he began, his finger tracing her image with infinite gentleness. She could sing birds from the trees and make angry horses calm with just her voice. The children loved her laugh. It sounded like water running over stones. He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "She died in the winter of 1875, disease that the white doctors could not cure. I watched her fade like morning mist until there was nothing left but memory." Beth felt tears prick her eyes, but she remained silent, understanding that this story needed to be told without interruption. "My oldest son, Running Wolf, believed he could fight the changes coming to our world," Huyana continued. "He joined the resistance, riding with Geronimo's band when they left the reservation. He was killed at Tres Castillos, shot down like a dog by Mexican soldiers who collected bounties for Apache scalps." The photograph trembled in his hands as he pointed to a young girl of perhaps 12, her eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. "Singing Bird, my daughter. She had your gift with animals, your fearless heart." The reservation broke her spirit slowly, like water wearing down stone. She died of sadness as much as sickness, surrounded by walls but dreaming of open sky. Finally, His finger found the youngest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 5 when the photograph was taken. Little Fox, my baby. One day he walked into the desert and never came back. Some say the army caught him. Others believe he found his way to Mexico. I choose to think he simply became one with the land that birthed him. When he finished speaking, a profound silence settled over them, broken only by the distant sounds of ranch life and Thunder Walker's quiet movements in his paddock. Beth reached out and placed her small hand over Huyana's weathered one, offering what comfort she could. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Huyana looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain. She couldn't fully comprehend, but somehow understood. For 15 years, I carried their faces in my heart and tried to forget their voices. I thought grief would kill me if I let it live, so I buried it deep and became a ghost of myself. "But you're not a ghost now," Beth said with quiet certainty. "You're here with me and Thunder Walker. You're teaching me wonderful things. Maybe your family would be proud of that." The simple wisdom of her words struck Huyana like lightning, illuminating truths he had been too frightened to examine. Perhaps his survival had purpose beyond mere existence. Perhaps the knowledge he carried was meant to be shared, not buried with his dead. "You remind me of Singing Bird," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "The same brave heart, the same way of seeing past the surface of things to what lies beneath. Teaching you has awakened parts of me I thought were dead forever." As the days passed following this revelation, their relationship deepened in ways that transcended the simple teacher-student dynamic they had started with. Beth began to understand that her lessons with Thunder Walker were part of a larger healing process, not just for the Mustang, but for Huyana and perhaps for the cultural wounds that seemed to define so much of life on the frontier. But the growing bond between the old Apache and the young girl also attracted increasing scrutiny from those who viewed such relationships with suspicion or hostility. Catherine Henderson found herself fielding questions from neighbors about the wisdom of allowing her daughter to spend so much time with a man whose people had, until recently, been considered enemies. "People are talking," she confided to Frank. One evening, as they watched Beth practice writing patterns with Thunder Walker, "Mrs. Patterson from town asked me if I thought it was proper for Beth to be learning savage ways." Her words, not mine. Frank's jaw tightened with anger, but his response was measured. "Let them talk. I've seen what that old man can do with horses, and I've watched him treat Beth with more respect and kindness than most white men show their own children. If that's savage behavior, then maybe we need more of it." The tensions came to a head when a group of neighboring ranchers arrived unannounced one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss water rights but clearly motivated by other concerns. Their leader, a florid-faced man named Harrison Briggs, made no effort to hide his disapproval of the situation he found at the Henderson Ranch. "Frank, we need to talk," Briggs announced, his eyes fixed on Beth and Huyana working with Thunder Walker in the distance. "There's been some concern in the community about the influences your granddaughter is being exposed to." "What kind of influences?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Well, hell, Frank," Briggs exploded. "You've got that child spending every day with an Apache, learning God knows what kind of heathen nonsense. It ain't natural, and it ain't safe." The confrontation that followed revealed the deep-seated prejudices that still ran through the territory like underground rivers, occasionally surfacing to poison relationships and destroy carefully built trust. Frank found himself defending not just Huyana's character, but the very principle that wisdom could cross cultural boundaries. "That heathen nonsense has taught my granddaughter more about horses in 2 months than most cowboys learn in years," Frank replied coldly. "And if you're questioning Huyana's character, you're questioning my judgment in keeping him on my payroll." The visitors left with their concerns unresolved. But their departure marked the beginning of a campaign of whispered criticism and social pressure that would test every relationship on the ranch. Beth, sensing the growing tension, even if she didn't fully understand its sources, clung more tightly to her lessons with Huyana, and her partnership with Thunder Walker, the eagle feather in her hair, seemed to catch the light differently during these troubled days, as if reminding her of the spiritual protection it represented. She would need that protection in the trials ahead, though she couldn't yet imagine the forms those trials would take. The revelation came on a scorching afternoon when the desert heat had driven everyone indoors except for Beth and Huyana, who continued their work with Thunder Walker despite the blazing sun. They had been practicing advanced riding techniques methods that required the horse and rider to move as a single entity, responding to thoughts and intentions rather than obvious commands. Beth had just completed a flawless series of tight turns and stops when a stranger's voice called out from the ranch house porch. "Well, I'll be damned." Falling Rock still alive after all these years. Both Beth and Huyana froze at the sound of that name, the Apache name that Huyana had not heard spoken aloud for more than a decade. They turned to see a weathered man in his 50s approaching the paddock, his cavalry uniform dusty from hard travel, but still bearing the insignia of a colonel. "Colonel Morrison," Huyana said quietly, his voice carrying notes of respect and wariness in equal measure. Beth looked between the two men, sensing the weight of shared history that hung between them like a bridge across troubled waters. The stranger's eyes held the calculating intelligence of a career soldier, but there was something else there too, genuine warmth and what looked like relief. "Falling Rock," Morrison repeated, shaking his head in wonder. "Do you know how many people have been looking for you? How many old reports I've had to file claiming you were dead when I suspected you were just too smart to be found?" Frank Henderson had emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of unexpected visitors. His expression grew puzzled as he observed the obviously cordial reunion between his hired hand and the cavalry officer. "Colonel," Frank said carefully, "I'm Frank Henderson. This is my ranch. Is there something I can help you with?" Morrison turned to Frank with obvious respect. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Colonel James Morrison, Territorial Military Liaison. I've been tracking down veterans for a special assignment. I believe you've been harboring one of the most decorated scouts in the history of the Apache campaigns." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and amazement that spread outward to encompass everyone within hearing. Beth dismounted from Thunder Walker and moved closer to Huyana, her hand instinctively seeking the reassurance of his presence. "I think you might have the wrong man," Frank said slowly. "This is Huyana. He's worked for me for 3 years." "Good. Man with horses, but his name is Falling Rock," Morrison interrupted gently. "And he's not just good with horses, Mr. Henderson. He's the man who saved my life at Skeleton Canyon. The scout who prevented 3 separate massacres by negotiating truces when diplomacy seemed impossible. The Apache who served as translator for every major peace conference between 1865 and 1880. Huyana remained silent, his weathered face a mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. But Beth, watching him with the intuitive understanding she had developed over months of close partnership, could see the subtle signs of a man wrestling with memories he had tried to bury. "That true?" Frank asked, his voice heavy with growing amazement. After a long moment, Huyana nodded slowly. "Colonel Morrison speaks truly, but that man that life ended long ago. I am only Huyana now, a man who cares for horses and tries to forget." Morrison stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Falling Rock, you can't just disappear from history. Your service record reads like something from a dime novel. You prevented the Colorado River War. You talked Chief Santos down from the warpath when everyone said it was impossible. You saved more lives both Apache and white, than any man I've ever known. The weight of these revelations settled over the assembled group like a heavy blanket. Beth found herself staring at her teacher with new eyes, suddenly understanding that the gentle old man who had shown her how to communicate with horses was actually a legend, a conda figure whose actions had shaped the very history of the territory they called home. "But the records say you died at San Carlos," Morrison continued, "shot trying to escape with a group of renegades." "I never believed it, but I did die at San Carlos," Huyana said quietly. "The man I was died when my family died." "What you see now is only the shell that remains." Beth could no longer remain silent. "That's not true," she said, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "You're not a shell. You're my teacher. You brought Thunder Walker and me together. You've shown me things about horses and life that nobody else could teach me." Her words seemed to pierce through Huyana's emotional armor in ways that Morrison's praise could not. The old Apache looked down at the child who had become so precious to him. Seeing in her earnest face a reflection of possibilities he had thought were lost forever, Morrison pulled a worn document from his coat pocket, an official military commendation bearing multiple signatures and an impressive seal. "This is the Congressional Medal of Honor that was approved for you in 1879. It's been waiting in Washington for 4 years because we couldn't confirm whether you were alive to receive it." The medal itself was wrapped in blue velvet, its bronze surface depicting an eagle and shield that seemed to echo the symbolism of the feather Beth wore in her hair. Morrison held it out toward Huyana with obvious reverence. "This belongs to you, Falling Rock, not just as recognition for past service, but as a symbol of what your knowledge and experience could still accomplish." Huyana stared at the medal as if it were a snake that might bite him. "I want no honors for deeds that failed to save the people I loved. All my wisdom, all my diplomacy, it could not prevent the destruction of my world." "Maybe not," Morrison agreed. "But look around you. Look at what you've accomplished here. This child," he gestured toward Beth, "she's riding that mustang like she was born to it. That's not failure, Falling Rock. That's transformation. That's building something new from the ashes of what was lost." Frank Henderson had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding and respect. "Colonel, you said you were tracking down veterans for a special assignment. What kind of assignment?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "There's trouble brewing along the border. Mexican raiders, renegade bands, maybe worse. The territorial governor wants to establish a special peacekeeping forcemen who understand the country and the people. Men who can prevent conflicts rather than just fighting them after they start." He turned back to Huyana with obvious hope. "We need experienced scouts, men who can read the signs and speak the languages. Men who've proven they can build bridges between cultures instead of burning them down. And you think I am such a man?" Huyana asked, his voice carrying decades of weariness. "I know you are," Morrison replied firmly. "Your service record proves it. But more than that," he gestured toward Beth and Thunder Walker, "what you've accomplished here proves it. You've taken a wild horse and a spirited child and created something beautiful. That's exactly the kind of skill we need." Beth had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm. The thought of losing Huyana, of having him called away to dangerous service in distant places, filled her with a fear she had never experienced. "You can't take him away," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He belongs here. Thunder Walker needs him. I need him." Morrison knelt down to meet Beth's eyes, his expression gentle but serious. "Young lady, I'm not here to take anyone away. I'm here to offer opportunities. But the choice belongs to Falling Rock, to Huyana himself." The old Apache looked at the medal in Morrison's hands, then at Beth's worried face, then at Thunder Walker, who had moved closer, as if sensing the emotional turmoil of his human companions. The weight of decision pressed down on him like a physical force. "I need time to think," he said finally. "This is not a choice to be made quickly." Morrison nodded understandingly. "Of course, I'll be in Mesilla for 3 days. But Falling Rock—" He paused, using the Apache name with obvious respect. "The territory needs men like you. And I think you need to remember who you really are." As the colonel departed, leaving the medal behind as both gift and challenge, Huyana found himself standing at a crossroads he had never expected to face. The past he had tried to bury was calling to him, offering purpose and recognition. But the present he had built, fragile as it was, held treasures he was reluctant to risk. Beth slipped her small hand into his weathered one, and he felt the warm weight of the eagle feather she wore, the symbol of protection and wisdom he had given her. "Whatever you decide," she said quietly, "I'll understand. But I hope you know that you've already saved more than you lost. You saved me and Thunderwalker. You saved yourself." In the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the evidence of lives transformed through patience and understanding, Huyana began to glimpse the shape of the choice that lay before him. The silver cavalry medal lay on Huyana's bunk like a sleeping snake, its polished surface catching the lamplight as he sat in contemplation through the long desert night. 3 days had passed since Colonel Morrison's visit, and the weight of decision had settled into his bones like winter cold. Beth had said little about the revelation of his true identity, but he could see the questions in her green eyes during their morning lessons. She watched him with new intensity, as if trying to reconcile the gentle teacher she knew with the legendary scout whose exploits had shaped territorial history. Thunderwalker seemed to sense the tension as well. The mustang had grown restless, pacing his paddock and calling out to the desert winds with sounds that spoke of longing and uncertainty. Even the other horses had caught the mood, their normal routines disrupted by currents of change they couldn't understand but clearly felt. On the morning of the 3rd day, as Huyana prepared for what might be his final lesson with Beth, Frank Henderson appeared at the bunkhouse door. The rancher's expression was grave, his usual confidence replaced by the worried look of a man facing problems beyond his experience. "We've got trouble, Huyana," Frank said without preamble. "Real trouble." The old Apache looked up from his contemplation of the medal, his weathered features instantly alert. Years of reading danger signs and the subtle changes of light and shadow, sound and silence, came flooding back to him. "What kind of trouble?" Frank held up a crumpled piece of paper, his hand trembling slightly with suppressed anger. "Found this, nailed to the gate this morning. Seems our neighbors have decided to take matters into their own hands." The message was brief but chilling in its implications. "Henderson, get rid of the Apache and his devil horse, or we'll do it for you. Last warning, concerned citizens of Mesilla Valley." Huyana read the note twice, his expression growing darker with each word. He had seen such messages before, had witnessed the ugly mob mentality that could transform ordinary settlers into instruments of violence when fear overwhelmed reason. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Hard to say," Frank replied. "But Harrison Briggs has been stirring up sentiment in town ever since his visit here. Claims you're a dangerous influence on Beth, that you're teaching her savage ways that will corrupt her moral character." The bitter irony of the accusation was not lost on either man. The same methods that had made Huyana one of the most effective peacekeepers in territorial history were now being characterized as corrupting influences on a child who had benefited immeasurably from his teaching. "There's more," Frank continued, reluctantly. "Word is they're planning to come tonight. Full force, probably armed. They want you gone, and they want Thunderwalker destroyed as proof that their authority won't be challenged." The threat to the horse hit Huyana like a physical blow. Thunderwalker had become more than just an animal. He was a symbol of everything Huyana had learned about bridging different worlds, about creating trust where none had existed before. The thought of the magnificent mustang being cut down by frightened men who couldn't understand his value filled the old Apache with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "Mr. Henderson," he said formally, reverting to the respectful distance he had maintained during his first months on the ranch, "I will leave tonight, before they come. This trouble is mine to bear, not yours." "Like hell you will," Frank replied, with surprising vehemence. "This is my ranch, and I choose who works here and who doesn't. No mob of scared neighbors is going to dictate how I run my business or who I call friend." The word friend hung in the air between them, carrying weight that neither man had acknowledged before. In the 3 years of Huyana's employment, their relationship had been cordial but professional. This crisis had stripped away the pretense to reveal something deeper. "They will burn your buildings," Huyana warned. "Hurt your family. I have seen what fear can make good people do." "Maybe," Frank acknowledged, "but running away won't solve anything. These people need to learn that courage isn't about ganging up on an old man and a little girl. Sometimes it's about standing up to the mob." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Beth appeared in the doorway, having overheard enough to understand the gravity of the situation. Her young face was pale but determined, and she clutched the eagle feather in her hand like a talisman. "They want to hurt Thunder Walker?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Huyana nodded gravely. "Some people fear what they do not understand. They see a wild horse and think only of danger, not beauty. They see an Apache and think only of old wars, not new friendships." Beth's jaw set with a determination that reminded everyone present of her grandfather's stubborn courage. "Then we have to protect him. We have to protect you." "Child," Huyana said gently, "this is not your fight. You must stay safe." "It is my fight," Beth interrupted with surprising force. "You're my teacher. Thunder Walker is my friend. Nobody gets to take away the people I love just because they're scared." The simple declaration hit both men with the force of revelation. In her fearless loyalty, Beth embodied everything they were fighting to preserve, the possibility that different worlds could meet in friendship rather than conflict. That wisdom could be shared across cultural boundaries, that love could triumph over fear. Frank cleared his throat roughly. "Well then, seems like we're all in agreement. Question is, what do we do about it?" Huyana stood slowly, the silver metal catching the light as he moved. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the stirring of something he had thought was dead forever, the tactical mind that had made him such an effective military scout, the strategic thinking that had prevented countless conflicts through careful planning and bold action. "How many men can you count on?" he asked Frank. "Dutch will stand with us, no question. Jimmy Cortez, too. I think he's seen what you can do and respects it. Wade Hutchins, ... double quotes. Frank paused, his expression troubled. "Wade's been quiet since that confrontation in the paddock. Hard to say which way he'll jump." Huyana nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. "And they will come how many? 20? 30? Probably closer to 15 or 20, Frank estimated. Enough to feel brave, not so many they can't move quietly." "Then we have advantages," Huyana said, his voice taking on the calm authority that had once made cavalry officers listen to his counsel. "We know the ground. We know when they will come. Most importantly, we know why we fight." He turned to Beth, his expression grave but filled with trust. "You will have the most important job of all. You and Thunder Walker must be ready to carry. Word to Colonel Morrison in Messiah if our other plans fail." Beth's eyes widened with understanding and fear. "You want me to ride Thunder Walker to town? In the dark?" "The Apache have ridden at night for 1,000 years, Huyana replied. "And Thunder Walker knows these desert paths better than any horse alive. If needed, You two could reach Messia faster than any pursuer could follow. The plan that emerged over the following hours was audacious in its simplicity and rooted in tactics that Huyana's people had perfected over generations of asymmetric warfare. They would not meet force with force. 15 armed men could easily overwhelm 3 defenders and a child. Instead, they would use knowledge, preparation, and the element of surprise to turn the attackers' numbers against them. Schmuller proved his worth by agreeing to the plan without hesitation, his simple loyalty cutting through the complex political considerations that might have paralyzed a more sophisticated man. Jimmy Cortez took longer to convince, but his respect for Huyana's abilities ultimately overcame his natural caution. Wade Hutchins presented the most difficult decision. When Frank approached him directly, the foreman's response was characteristically blunt. "I won't ride against you, Frank," he said carefully, "but I won't ride with the Apache either. This is between you and the town. I'll be in my bunk with my rifle protecting ranch property. What happens outside is your business." It was perhaps the best they could hope for neutrality rather than active opposition. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the defenders made their final preparations. Huyana had donned the silver medal, wearing it openly for the first time as both symbol and commitment. The boy who had once been called Falling Rock was fully awake now, his tactical mind sharp and focused on the battle ahead. Beth spent the evening with Thunder Walker, the bond deepening as they prepared for what might be their greatest test. The Mustang seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his movements alert and responsive as Beth whispered Apache phrases that Huyana had taught her, words of courage and protection that carried the power of countless generations. "Remember," Huyana told her as darkness settled over the ranch, "if the signal comes, you ride for Messia without looking back. Thunder Walker will carry you safely, but you must trust him completely." Beth nodded solemnly, the eagle feather secured firmly in her hair. "I understand." But Huyana, she used his real name with deliberate respect. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll remember that you're not alone anymore." The old Apache looked down at the child who had become so precious to him, seeing in her face the courage and wisdom that had drawn him back from the edge of despair. "I promise, little one. We fight for more than survival tonight. We fight for the right to build bridges instead of walls." As the desert night deepened around them, the defenders took their positions and waited for the sound of approaching trouble. In the distance, Thunder Walker stood sentinel in his paddock, ready to carry hope across the darkness if called upon. The battle for the Henderson ranch and for the principle that different worlds could meet in friendship was about to begin. The war paint felt strange on Huyana's face after so many years. The traditional marks of red ochre and white clay that his grandfather had taught him to apply before important battles. He had mixed the pigments himself from materials gathered in the desert, following patterns that carried the protective power of generations. The face looking back at him from the small mirror in the bunkhouse was no longer that of a broken old man hiding from his past. The paint had awakened something primal and powerful, the warrior spirit that had never truly died, but had only been sleeping beneath layers of grief and resignation. "You look different," Beth observed quietly from the doorway, her young voice carrying notes of awe and uncertainty. Huyana turned to face her, seeing his transformation reflected in her wide eyes. "This is how my people prepared for important battles. The paint reminds us who we are and why we fight." The sound of approaching horses reached them through the desert. Night, multiple riders moving with the confidence of men who believed their cause was righteous and their victory assured. Huyana estimated at least 15 men, possibly more, their mounts' hoofbeats creating a rhythm of intimidation as they approached the ranch buildings. "It's time," he said quietly, checking the rifle. Frank had given him one final time. "Remember, if you hear the owl call 3 times, you ride for Messia without hesitation." Beth nodded, her small hand gripping the braided rope she and Huyana had made together, a kai's length of rawhide and horsehair that symbolized their partnership and would serve as Thunder Walker's only guidance in the desperate ride ahead if needed. The attackers came exactly as Huyana had predicted, approaching the main ranch house with torches held high and voices raised in angry demands for surrender. Harrison Briggs led them, his florid face flushed with righteous indignation and probably whiskey. "Henderson," Briggs shouted, "we know you're in there. Send out that Apache and his devil horse, and nobody gets hurt." Frank Henderson stepped onto his porch, a shotgun cradled casually in his arms, his bearing calm and dignified despite the mob arrayed against him. "Gentlemen, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you turn around and ride back to town before someone does something they'll regret. We're out leaving without that Indian," another voice called from the darkness. "He's corrupted your granddaughter with his heathen ways, and that horse of his is dangerous to decent folk." "The only dangerous thing I see here is a mob of frightened men trying to solve problems with threats and violence," Frank replied evenly. "Huyana is my employee and my friend. He's done nothing but good work and shown respect to my family." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, with threats and counter-threats escalating until someone's nerve broke. But Huyana had no intention of allowing the situation to spiral out of control. Using skills honed during decades of scouting and reconnaissance, he had positioned himself in the shadows near the ranch's main corral, where he could observe the attackers without being seen. What he witnessed confirmed his tactical assessment. The mob was composed primarily of townsmen and small ranchers, good men individually, perhaps, but dangerous in their collective fear and ignorance. They had come expecting easy intimidation and quick surrender, not prepared for organized resistance. More importantly, they had made the classic mistake of focusing all their attention on the obvious target, the ranch house, while ignoring the strategic importance of the surrounding terrain. Huyana's Apache training had taught him to think like water, flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them directly. The first phase of his plan unfolded with the silent precision of a desert predator, moving through shadows that seemed to welcome his painted face and soft-soled moccasins. He began to demonstrate why Apache warriors had been feared across the Southwest for their ability to appear and disappear like spirits. One by one, the attackers' horses began to wander away from their positions, not stampeding that would have created chaos and potential injury, but simply walking off into the darkness as their reins were mysteriously cut and their natural instincts toward freedom were gently encouraged. "What the hell?" one of the men exclaimed as he turned to find his mount missing. "Where'd my horse go?" The discovery that their retreat might be compromised sent ripples of uncertainty through the mob. These were practical men who understood that being afoot in the desert at night was more than inconvenient. It was potentially deadly. "Spread out," Briggs commanded, his earlier confidence beginning to crack. "Find those horses." But as the attackers dispersed to search for their missing mounts, they discovered that their troubles were only beginning. Ropes appeared from nowhere to tangle their feet. Shadows moved with purpose that suggested hostile intelligence. The confident mob began to fragment into isolated, nervous individuals jumping at every sound. From her position with Thunder Walker, Beth watched the masterful display of tactical psychology with growing amazement. This was the legendary scout in action, not the gentle teacher she knew, but the warrior who had earned his reputation through intelligence and skill rather than brute force. The war paint on Huyana's face seemed to glow with its own inner light. As he moved through the darkness, a ghost walker made manifest, turning the attackers' numbers against them through confusion and misdirection. The braided rope in Beth's hand seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as Thunder Walker shifted restlessly beneath the starlit sky. The magnificent mustang's ears swiveled constantly, tracking the sounds of chaos that Huyana's tactics had unleashed among the attackers. What had begun as an organized mob bent on violence had devolved into scattered groups of increasingly panicked men stumbling through the darkness, their confidence shattered by encounters with shadows that struck without warning and disappeared. Like desert spirits, Beth could see the transformation in the attackers' behavior from her concealed position near the far paddock. Men who had arrived with torches held high and voices raised in righteous anger now moved with the jerky uncertainty of prey animals sensing a predator's presence. Their horses had vanished into the night. Their weapons seemed inadequate against an enemy they couldn't locate, and their numbers, once a source of strength, had become a liability as they stumbled into each other in the darkness. "Where is he?" Harrison Briggs's voice cracked with frustration and growing fear. "One old Indian can't just disappear." But Huyana had done exactly that, using skills perfected over decades of Apache warfare to become one with the night itself. The war paint on his face wasn't merely decoration. It was transformation, awakening the legendary scout who had earned his reputation through intelligence and cunning rather than brute force. Thunderwalker's head shot up suddenly, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made Beth's blood run cold. The approaching riders weren't just panicked townsmen anymore. Someone was coming with deadly intent, moving with purpose through the chaos toward their hiding place. "Easy, boy," Beth whispered, her small hand stroking the Mustang's powerful neck. "We're ready for whatever comes." The braided rope had been crafted for this moment, its intertwined strands of leather and horsehair representing not just their partnership, but the fusion of two worlds that had created something stronger than either could achieve alone. If the signal came 3 owl calls echoing across the desert, she and Thunderwalker would ride for Messiah with a speed and grace that no pursuit could match. But it was the absence of that signal that filled Beth with growing dread. Huyana had promised to call out if their position became untenable, which meant either he was still in control of the situation or something had happened to prevent him from warning her. The sound of approaching footsteps made the decision for her. 3 men emerged from the darkness, their rifles gleaming in the starlight as they moved toward Thunderwalker's paddock with obvious malicious intent. Beth recognized Harrison Briggs in the lead, his face twisted with the kind of desperate anger that made men dangerous beyond reason. "There's the devil horse," Briggs muttered to his companions. "At least we can accomplish something tonight." Thunder. Walker tensed as the threat became unmistakable, his powerful body coiling like a spring as centuries of wild instincts prepared him for fight or flight. But Beth felt a strange calm descend over her, the same centered peace that Huyana had taught her to cultivate when working with frightened animals. "You don't want to hurt him," she said quietly, stepping into view with the braided rope held loosely in her hands. "He's never done anything to you." The 3 men froze at the sight of the small figure emerging from the shadows, their weapons wavering as they confronted the reality of threatening a child. Whatever justifications they had constructed for their actions began to crumble in the face of Beth's fearless dignity. "Get away from that horse, girl," Briggs commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. "That animal is dangerous." "No," Beth replied with the quiet authority she had learned from months of working with powerful creatures. "You're the dangerous ones. You came here with weapons and hate, looking to destroy something beautiful because you don't understand it." Thunder. Walker moved to stand beside her, his magnificent head held high as he faced the armed men without fear. The Mustang's transformation from wild outlaw to loyal partner was evident in every line of his body, his trust in Beth absolute and unwavering. "Look at him," Beth continued, her voice carrying the wisdom that had emerged from her unique education. "Really look. Do you see a devil? Or do you see what happens when someone chooses understanding over fear?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge to everything the men believed about the world. Here was a child who had accomplished what seasoned cowboys could not, standing beside a horse that radiated calm strength instead of chaotic wildness. It was then that Huyana appeared from the darkness behind the would-be attackers, his war-painted face terrible and beautiful in the flickering light of their abandoned torches. He moved with the fluid silence of his ancestors, positioning himself where he could protect both Beth and Thunderwalker, while demonstrating the futility of violence. "Lower your weapons," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded respect across two cultures. "This ends now, with dignity intact for all." The silver cavalry medal on his chest caught the starlight, its presence a reminder that heroism could take many forms. Briggs stared at the decorated veteran with growing confusion, his simple worldview challenged by the complexity of the man before him. "You're supposed to be the enemy," Briggs said uncertainly. "I am your neighbor," Huyana replied with gentle firmness. "I am the man who has worked alongside you for 3 years, who has earned his place through honest labor and respect for others. The only enemy here is the fear that makes good people do evil things." Colonel Morrison's arrival with cavalry reinforcements ended any possibility of continued violence, but the real victory had already been achieved. As the would-be attackers laid down their weapons and began the humbling process of explaining their actions, Beth felt the braided rope in her hands transform from tool of escape into symbol of connection. The night that had begun with threats of destruction had ended with demonstration of the power that emerged when courage met wisdom, when trust conquered fear, when the bonds between different worlds proved stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. 6 months after the night that changed everything, the Henderson Ranch had become something unprecedented in the New Mexico territory, a place where two worlds met in harmony rather than conflict. The new saddle that Beth used for her daily rides with Thunderwalker embodied this transformation, its design incorporating both traditional Apache techniques and modern Western practicality, crafted by a master leather worker in Santa Fe according to specifications that Huyana had carefully drawn. The saddle represented the successful marriage of different traditions. The seated stirrups followed conventional patterns that any cowboy would recognize, but the bridle work incorporated Apache methods that allowed for subtler communication between horse and rider. Most remarkably, the leather itself had been decorated with symbols that told the story of their unlikely partnership, an eagle feather intertwined with a braided rope, surrounded by stylized horses running free beneath endless sky. Beth ran her fingers over these symbols as she prepared Thunderwalker for their morning ride, each touch reminding her of the journey that had brought them all to this moment of peace. The mustang stood patiently as she worked, his once wild nature now channeled into willing partnership without any loss of the spirit that made him magnificent. "Ready for today's adventure?" she asked, and Thunderwalker's ears pricked forward with obvious enthusiasm. Their destination was the new riding school that had grown organically from Huyana's teaching methods. What had begun as informal lessons for neighboring children had evolved into something approaching a formal academy, drawing students from as far away as Albuquerque and El Paso. Parents who had once viewed Apache horse training with suspicion now traveled hundreds of miles to enroll their children in programs that promised not just riding skills but wisdom about the deeper connections between humans and animals. The school operated out of a series of new buildings constructed with Frank Henderson's enthusiastic support and funded by donations from families whose children had been transformed by Huyana's teaching. The main lodge was built in territorial style but incorporated Apache design elements, a fusion of architectural traditions that mirrored the cultural bridge building happening within its walls. Huyana himself had changed as dramatically as his surroundings. The broken old man who had once hidden his identity behind the simplified name of Huyana now wore his real name, Falling Rock, with quiet pride. The Congressional Medal of Honor hung in a place of honor in his private quarters, not as a monument to past glories, but as a reminder that service to others could take many forms. He had accepted Colonel Morrison's offer to serve as a territorial peacekeeping consultant, but on his own terms. Rather than riding into combat zones to negotiate after conflicts had erupted, he worked proactively to prevent problems before they started. His reputation as a man who could build understanding between different communities had spread throughout the Southwest, and his advice was sought by military commanders, territorial officials, and tribal leaders alike. But his greatest satisfaction came from the daily work with horses and children, watching new partnerships form between species and cultures that had too often been seen as incompatible. The riding school had become a laboratory for proving that cooperation was possible where conflict had once seemed inevitable. This morning's class included 12 students ranging in age from 8 to 16, representing a remarkable diversity of backgrounds. There were ranchers' children learning to see horses as partners rather than tools, town kids discovering that courage could be cultivated through patient practice, and even several Apache youth whose families had been convinced that the old ways could survive within the new world. Beth had become Huyana's unofficial assistant instructor, her natural talent and deep understanding of his methods making her an invaluable bridge between his wisdom and the student's curiosity. At 11 years old, she possessed skills that impressed seasoned cowboys and a teaching ability that seemed to emerge from pure instinct. "Remember," she told a nervous boy attempting his first bareback ride, "the horse can feel everything you're feeling. If you're scared, he'll be scared too. But if you're calm and confident, he'll trust you to keep both of you safe." The transformation in the boy's posture was immediate and remarkable. As his anxiety melted away, replaced by focused concentration, his horse's movements became fluid and responsive. Within minutes, they were moving together as a single unit, boy and horse communicating through subtle shifts of weight and intention rather than crude applications of force. Huyana watched this small miracle with the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his true calling. Each successful partnership validated his belief that understanding was always possible if approached with patience and respect. The Apache ways that had once seemed destined for extinction were not only surviving but thriving, adapted to new circumstances while retaining their essential wisdom. Frank Henderson arrived as the morning session was concluding, his own transformation evident in the easy familiarity with which he interacted with students and horses alike. The practical rancher had become one of the riding school's most effective advocates, using his community standing to promote understanding and acceptance. "Colonel Morrison sent word," he told Huyana as they watched the students unsaddle there. "Horses with careful attention to proper technique. There's a situation developing near the border, two ranching families feuding over water rights. Getting ugly fast. He's asking if you'd be willing to mediate before it turns violent." Huyana considered the request with the gravity it deserved. Such work was important and necessary, but it also meant time away from the school and the daily satisfaction of teaching children to communicate with horses. "I'll go," he decided after a moment. "But I'll take Beth and Thunder Walker with me." Sometimes the sight of a child and horse working in perfect harmony can remind adults what cooperation looks like. Beth's face lit up with excitement at the prospect of adventure, but her response showed the maturity that her experiences had fostered. "Only if you think it will help. I don't want to get in the way of important work." "Child," Huyana said with a smile that held depths of affection and pride, "you are the important work. Everything else is just application of the principles you help me demonstrate every day." As the afternoon sun painted the desert in familiar shades of gold and amber, the unlikely family that had formed around Thunder Walker's paddock gathered to plan their next mission. They had proven that bridges could be built between different worlds, that wisdom could survive cultural transformation, that trust could triumph over fear. The wild mustang who had once been impossible to ride now stood calmly among children. And adults, his magnificent spirit intact but channeled toward partnership rather than resistance. The old Apache who had thought his purpose was buried with his family had found new meaning in teaching and service. The fearless child who had climbed onto a dangerous horse had grown into a young woman whose courage inspired everyone around her. Their story had begun with a joke, a suggestion that seemed absurd on its surface but contained profound truth beneath. Sometimes the most important lessons came disguised as simple moments, and sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produced the most beautiful results. As Thunder Walker carried Beth toward the horizon where new challenges waited. The desert. Wind carried their laughter across the vast landscape, a sound of joy that promised hope for all who heard it and believed in the possibility of understanding across any divide.